Once again, immediate flashing light warning as we transition to the next world. It's just a consistent thing with how this game works. Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Donkey Kong 94. In the last part, we finished off Worlds 3 and 4 and made our way here to World 5, the Desert. We're immediately going to get introduced to the mechanic we saw at the cutscene at the end of last part, the Super Hammer. Like I mentioned then, this is effectively the same thing as the normal hammer, only it can actively break special blocks as well. And this is one of my favorite levels to go fast in because actively just trading from hammer to hammer and throwing it up to the next area is just weirdly exciting for me. The Super Hammer does swing faster, of course, and it will still kill enemies, but more often than not, you're just using it to break blocks. With that said, it does not quite replace the normal hammer moving forward, but you're going to see it about as often at the very least. But like I mentioned last time, it's actually a distinct reference to the Golden Hammer from the original Wrecking Crew, which also got represented in Smash Brothers, which is pretty fitting, as Wrecking Crew actively also got a sequel in the Game Boy, Wrecking Crew 98, that was developed partially by Nintendo R&D 1, but also partially by this game's laid side developer, Pax Sofnica. So if anything, they kind of manifested that seemingly. Speaking of which, actually, let's immediately go back into talking about the game's staff. The last credit we talked about was the main programmers. The game's co-programmer is Motu Yasuma, who started on Earthbound Beginnings as a programmer. They were on Balloon Kid on Game Boy as a programmer. They were a Checker on Wave Race, programmer for Balloon Kid on the NES, co-programmer for this. Snoopy Concert, they were in Special Thanks. Mole Mania, a programmer. Tane Omakutori on the Wonder Swan, that Raven-based puzzle game, the Wonder Swan, they were a programmer. Card Capture Soccer game I talked about last time, programmer there. And they were also a Balloon Kid programmer for the Game Boy Color and a programmer on Mother 1+2 on the Game Boy Advance. Again, largely because those were all games Pax Sofnica was directly involved in, because they were more likely an employee there rather than main Nintendo. This level is a pretty good example of something that kind of becomes a trend towards the latter half of the game, where the levels get larger, as we've already talked about, yes, and there's more steps getting the key, or getting the key itself as the puzzle. But there's also a huge chunk of each level I'm probably not really even accessing that much, because it's largely only tied to getting Pauline's items. And since I'm not worrying about getting them for the extra lives, because I'm at, 98, it doesn't really leave an impact because of that. I want to say this was the last world I had to re-record. It was either that or the previous world. Again, I can't remember off the top of my head. Future me, take a look back in the files if you can. Whether or not it was world 4 or 5 I had to start re-recording from. But, yeah, that happened. This is a very fast Donkey Kong mini-boss. A lot of the time when you see the ladders that move up and down to become complete ladders or not, there's usually other ways around the level design rather than just using them. The triple jump and the backflip especially can get you a pretty good distance there. But every now and then, you're just required to use them. That's not even that bad. Also, that looks like that might be a mechanic, but actually there's never a single time in the game where you can impact Mario's head on a ceiling and have him get stunned. It does seem like something this game would do, but as far as I know, there's never a time that happens. Speaking of Donkey Kong, though, in terms of like the mini-bosses as well as the end-of-world boss fights, worth noting, this game was going to have non-Donkey Kong bosses early on in development, and we know this due to a Nintendo Power article covering it from, I think, the year it came out, just about, where there's a picture of a giant flying scroll that seemingly would have just been a normal boss fight, presumably in the forest world or the jungle world, if I had to take a guess. But supposedly the reason they got cut was because it just didn't really gel with the game too much, and it kind of took presence away from Donkey Kong, which, yeah, that was probably the right move. I just wish maybe they had done a little bit more to make the actual end-of-world Donkey Kong bosses stand out a little bit more than the way the barrels interact with the level itself. Like, as it is, there's only really one boss in this game that I think feels really good, and we're not going to see that until the end game, so we'll talk more about that then. For some reason, every time I play this game, I take a very silly death here, and it even happened in my practice playthrough where I'll go from the top right ear enemy with the first hammer down to open the key in the second, knowing that I still have to get the switch over here. But a fall from where the first hammer is down to the bottom floor where the door and key are is enough to be an instant kill fall, so be careful. So, for the moment while we continue through this world, let's go back to talking about the game's staff. The next credit set listed is the CG designer, so the artists who did a lot of the 2D arts for the game, or at times even probably some of the specialized pixel art. There are 3 people listed: Takuya Imamura, Hideo Kon, and Kenta Usui. Notably, out of those 2, alongside some of the directors we talked about earlier, Hideo Kon and Kenta Usui are also course designers, so they're also level designers for the game. Takaya Imamura started as a staff member on the original F-Zero, both on the Super Nintendo and in arcades, and then they were an object designer, so a graphic designer for A Link to the Past and Star Fox. They did CG design for this and Stunt Race FX, art director for Star Fox 64, course designer for F-Zero X. They were the art director for Majora's Mask as well, so they're very close to my heart for that record. After that, they were largely in a supervisor role, supervising for NCL on Star Fox Adventures, being a supervisor on F-Zero GX, GP Legend, and Climax, co-producer on Star Fox Assault, producer on Star Fox Command, supervisor on Brawl, Star Fox 64 3D. The most recent things they've been a director and actively involved in development in a non-supervising role was Steel Diver Sub Wars on 3DS, that game that, if memory serves, was a pretty big way of how people figured out how to crack that thing for piracy. And otherwise, homebrewing. They were the director on Tank Troopers, supervisor on Star Fox Guard, art director again on Majora's Mask 3D, and their most recent credits are on Paper Trail on Windows as in the special thanks, and as a character designer for Grappin on Windows. This is a Donkey Kong encounter that's always kind of bugged me. Not that it's annoying or hard, it just feels weirdly placed. For what's effectively just a taller variation of the first level in this game as well as the original arcade game, it feels weird to have it effectively at the halfway point of the game. I don't know, it's just always felt a little weird. And I think this is technically the time where they teach you that you can actually throw enemies into the other to kill them, but also keep in mind that the corpses of enemies that you hit, no matter what, will also count as projectiles, so use that to your advantage. So next up out of the CG designers is Hideo Khan, also a course designer like I mentioned. They were a scenario assistant on Earthbound Beginnings, they were staff on Radar Mission. Wave Race, they were a graphic designer, same with this, being a course designer. Scenario assistant on Mother 1+2 for the same reason, and then they were noticeably absent until they were the art director on New Little King Story on the PS Vita. Then they were on localization development for Hyde Incorporated on Jack Jean on the Switch. They were a member of the visual design team on Digimon Survive, which that was in development for a while. They did some UI stuff for Battlefield Waltz, and their most recent entry is actually being a 2D designer on Rune Factory Guardians of Ozma on the Switch and Switch 2, so I guess that means they're probably technically with Marvelous nowadays, unless they're considered freelance? And the final of the CG designers, who's also a course designer, is Kenta Usui, who I think we technically talked about before on a different LP. They started as a graphic designer on Mario All-Stars on the Super Nintendo, then they were on this. After this, they were a level designer for Yoshi's Island, Mario 64, graphic design for Wave Race 64, they did level design for Ocarina of Time. They were the dungeon director for Majora's Mask, so some of the strongest temples in the series to this day, directed by them. An overall director for Mario Sunshine, assistant director for Wind Waker, director for Pokemon Box of all things. They did boss battle planning for Twilight Princess, New Mario Wii, they did map and level design. Same with New Mario U and Super Luigi U. Yoshi's New Island, map and level design, so they've largely been in the level design aspect pretty much since this. Their most recent credits, outside of being in the special thanks for Princess Peach Showtime, was that they were a game designer for Splatoon 3, and they were a level designer on Good Job and Yoshi's Crafted World. So the next level in specific is one that's stuck with me over the years because it's probably one of the most puzzling stages on a first playthrough. As the door's up there, and the key is right next to us, you need to figure out arrangements with these platforms to reach the door safely. If memory serves, there's a couple that work, but I've tended to do something like this over the years where I just place the spring slightly above the ground and then jump up and grab other platforms from there. This is one you kind of have to feel out, but again, there's several solutions you can actively use here if memory serves. Take advantage of the fact that the timers for things like this reset whenever you place a new one down, and you can probably figure out a couple of good ways to do this. I don't even think this is the most efficient way. There's definitely more efficient ways to do this if I had to guess. But this is what I've tended to do over my years of playing this game, which, again, it's been a while. So, the next person listed in the credits is the composer for the game, who is Taisuke Araki. This was their third credit after Wave Race on Game Boy being the composer there, as well as top ranked tennis on the Game Boy as a member of the staff. They were then the director of Shin Onagashima's Zen Pen on the Super Nintendo, so another PAX Softnica employee then. Wrecking Crew 98, Famicom Bunko, Hajimari no Mori, which is another PAX Softnica text-based adventure game on the Super Nintendo. But then they go from that in 1999 to being the director of a game I played a lot of in the mid-2000s, the 2004 Battle Beat-em-on game on Game Boy Advanced. I don't lie, I've been tempted to do that as an LP more times than I'd like to admit, despite it being a very repetitive game. On top of the fact, I would have to do a lot of very high-pitched voices and memory serves about the voice cast of the anime, and no thanks for that. They were then a programmer on Dinosaur King for the DS, the, I think, partially Sega-developed RPG. They were then an event programmer for Style Savvy Fashion Forward on the 3DS, and their most recent credit is as an engineer on the North American version of Magia record Puella Magi Madoka Magica. So, one of the various mobile games based on that specific anime. This is a boss fight with Donkey Kong that's harder than it looks because your barrels are no longer barrels, they're enemies who can kill you by walking into you. Surprisingly difficult to do that and avoiding getting hit on any aspects. I don't know why that's just so specifically hard for me to get around, but it really is. With that said, we're now done with the desert, so it's time for us to move on to what's probably my least favorite world in the game, because while it's not the longest one, it definitely gets in my way the most. Let's see, I look at that. I don't even have any way to get extra lives anymore because I'm at 99, but 8 lives from this final third of this world in general. It's, again, really easy to rack up lives here. Also, once again, flashing light warning as we transition from World 5, the desert, into World 6, the airplane. Also worth noting, the end of any given world is also the only times you're actively prompted to save, but I think you can save at any point in time by pausing in a level and then selecting save and end. I think that even saves the exact level you're on. So the airplane is actually a world that has a main mechanical gimmick, wind platforming. You are constantly being pushed to a side, usually towards the right side of the screen while you're in levels here. And because you're on, at times, pretty thin platforms, at most 2 tiles wide, you gotta be really careful about getting around things here. Make sure you duck carefully, because that can easily help you get around things as well. Although, not for nothing, I think you could also theoretically use the platform there to block the bullets, but I don't think I've ever really tried that. Ultimately, the biggest annoyance here is just trying to fight against the wind when you're moving towards the left, which you're gonna have to do a lot in this world. This next level is a bit of a funny one because of the fake door mechanic I talked about earlier in the LP that just does nothing besides be a distraction for you. Because I think they go a little overboard on the door count. With that said, something I didn't mention when we talked about these earlier in the LP, you can always tell which door is the real one besides the fact you can just walk in front of it and clear the stage when you have the key, because it's the one that Pauline's screams for help come out of, which actually, I should probably talk about that. Pauline's screams for help are actually one of the main reasons I decided to play this game via the Super Game Boy, rather than just outright via the Game Boy version, because they're more like sounds going, wow, wow, in the Game Boy release, and it hurts my ears. Meanwhile, they actively have a crunchy voice sample, but a voice sample all the same here on the Super Game Boy. That I've heard more than one person say over the years, like, actively concerned or alerted their cat when it was playing off their TV speakers and the like over the years. That's not exactly my experience, because my cat Zelda, who I've had for, God, 14 years almost at this point, basically didn't give a shit, but that's because she just likes sleeping and enjoying the crunch food and trying to eat tiny plastic bags out of my trash can that I just keep telling her no with, but she keeps trying. This is a level that gave me some trouble in my first playthrough, because for some reason I just had a really bad penchant to just fall off the platforms that are moving at the top of the screen all the way down towards the doors, which I think in every case is enough to kill you. You really need to actively use that block in the center of the screen right now as a stopgap to prevent yourself from dying. I believe that lever up there will reverse the direction in which the platforms are going, which can be handy to help speed things along, but if you just take a fall like that along the way, you're gonna be just fine. So, next up in the game's staff is the course designers. We've talked about a couple of these already. These are the level designers. Masayuki Kamiyama, Hideo Kon, Katsutomo Meiwa, Kuniko Sakurai, Takao Shimizu, Kenji Umeda, and Kenta Usui. Of those names, we have yet to talk about Katsutomo Maiwa, Kuniko Sakurai, and Kenji Umeda. Katsutomo Maiwa started on Earthbound Beginnings as a scenario assistant, then they were on the staff for Radar Mission, Checker for Wave Race, course designer here, special thanks in Mole Mania and Snoopy Concert, a helper on Famicom Buko, Hajimari no Mori again, project manager on Ham Hams Unite, designer on Ham Ham Heartbreak, and a scenario assistant on Mother 1+2, so they are another PAX Softnica employee. And Kuniko Sakurai is much the same. They started as a designer on the first Shin Onagashima on the NES. They were a music affection on Fire Rock and NES, Earthbound Beginnings, scenario assistant, coordinator on Balloon Kid on Game Boy, and a director on the NES version. Course designer here, special thanks to Mole Mania. Scenario planner on Shin Onagashima Zenpen, coordinator on Blue Kid on Game Boy Color, scenario assistant on Mother 1+2, and then the Game Boy Advance in Wii, Shin Onagashima, they were a designer. Rounding out that set of characters, Kenji Umeda started as a programmer on the first Shin Onagashima, then they were on this. Special thanks for Snoopy, Concert, and Mole Mania, and their most recent credits are on the Game Boy Advance and Wii Shin Onogashima, so we haven't seen them in a credit sequence seemingly since 2007. This is another level I've taken some really dumb deaths in over the years, because the projectiles from these cannons are surprisingly hard for me to avoid for some reason, even though the cannons themselves are very set in what they do. They'll either shoot straight forward, then they'll shoot diagonally, then they'll shoot straight up. The diagonal shots are the ones that mess me up more often than I'd like to admit, though, because for some reason I'm just really bad about tracking the diagonal shots. In this game specifically, I'm assuming because it's one of the few things that'll actively move diagonally largely, because largely a lot of the other things move just left to right or up and down. Seldom is there a diagonal projectile, and trust me, when you're not used to that in a game like this, it'll really mess you up out of nowhere. The next level's a little fun, though. It's probably my favorite level in this world, if only because it's one of the few levels in it where the wind platforming exists, where the wind platforming is more there to help you than not. Because if you're really good about it, you can really time some jumps to get some really good long distance out of it with the wind here. And with this specific diagonal wire here, you can also completely ignore the wind on the way over to the left back here for the key. With that said, you gotta be really careful there, because if you go just slow enough, you'll just barely not make it over the second spike pit, and that sucks. Especially because if you miss it and make it only to that middle platform, I think you do need to jump back to the right to swing on the diagonal rope again, because with the wind there, you're not getting enough momentum to cross those spikes normally. The second to last stage here in World 6 is probably the overall hardest one, despite not having the wind platforming in it, because it's one of the few times they really play around with a mechanic we've talked about before, the fact that when you pick up a key, it fades. What we need to do here is go up to the top layer and grab the key, and then use the conveyor belts here to move the key slowly downwards alongside us. However, we need to move the key into the middle section here where there's spikes blocking both an entrance and exit, so we can't go with the key. What you need to do is get over here and press the switches to change the directions the conveyor belts are going, get down a layer, and grab the key before it vanishes. Like I believe I said before, I believe the fading of the key depends on the level with how fast it goes, but there is a general time sink of, let's say, about at least 5-7 seconds before it fades all the way. You gotta be pretty on top of this, and on a first playthrough, it definitely feels weirdly strict. But even on like a second run of the level after finishing it, you really do understand the timing much better. Just make sure you spawn in this ladder before you follow the key, by the way. Not that it's a big issue, but I've had more playthroughs than I'd like to admit just go south because I decided to put the ladder down first. And once we get this over here, we need to pick it up one more time, throw it back on the conveyor belt and reverse it, and follow it all the way here, and then slowly throw it up the platforms to reach the door, I think, on the third platform up here. I want to say this level might have the most doors out of any level in the game. Which is funny, because technically speaking, the range with doors is 0 to like 9. But the 0 door thing is in one very specific level, and that's not a boss fight. And we'll talk about that, I believe, next part. The Donkey Kong fight at the end of this world is one of the more annoying ones, because you have to worry about actively catching the barrels if they bounce off the platforms or off your feet, while dealing with wind platforming, and the wind in this level specifically messes me up more times than I would really like to admit. If only because I really do try to overcorrect myself with the wind, and that causes more deaths than a lot of other things. I think that's my big weakness with wind platforming specifically. The deaths often don't come from the wind itself, it's me trying to overcorrect back onto a platform because of it. With that said, still prefer that to darkness platforming, as I've talked about countless times on this channel. And thus we go from the high air down to the frozen seas for another fan least favorite level in this specific game. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 4, we enter World 7. See you guys then.